Hey, it's Bella, and I'm back with the final part of my story. Last time, I found out the shocking truth about Ed. Turns out, he never loved me. No, instead, he was in love with his half-sister, Ellie, who isn't actually his biological sister at all. It was so much information to process already. But to make it even worse, Ed's mom messaged him, insisting all three of us go to her house right away. As soon as I entered Stafford's lavish home, I felt so nervous. Ed spoke out.
"Mom, Dad, what's wrong?"
Mrs. Stafford gave him a stern look and replied, "You need to explain this right now." Then she showed the same picture of Ed and Ellie that John had sent me. Before anyone had a chance to reply, she looked at me. "You're Ed's girlfriend? Did you know about this?" I was confused, then said, I only found out today." She was furious and yelled at Ed and Ellie. "What is this? You two are crazy? How could you do such incestuous things?" She didn't let Ed and Ellie explain, then continued. "Did it cross your minds what would happen if other people saw this picture? I'm so ashamed of both of you." Ed stood up and replied,
"But, Mom, we don't share the same bloodline. Why can't I love Ellie?"
His mom looked so confused. So Ellie looked at her with tear-filled eyes and said, "It's true. He's not my biological dad. It was my mom's idea. She just wanted me to have a secure future. I never wanted to deceive anyone, and I honestly do care about you all, and I'm so sorry." Mrs. Stafford shouted, "What did you say? You aren't my husband's biological child? You don't have any blood relationships with us whatsoever? In that case, why do you dare live here in our house? And now you're using my son so you can get your hands on his fortunes?" Ed replied,
"Mom, don't say that. Ellie is not that kind of girl. I love her, and I know she loves me too."
Mr. Stafford, who'd been sitting there silently, suddenly spoke up.
"I know. I've always known. I took a DNA test years ago, but I decided to keep this secret and continue to raise Ellie because I love her as my own."
He looked at her.
"You've always been my little docile daughter, and I'm always proud of you, Ellie."
Ellie burst into tears. Ed hugged her and comforted her. Mrs. Stafford was so angry, and she said, "You all knew the truth, but chose to leave me in the dark. I demand she leaves this house right now, else I will." Then she stormed out of the room. The atmosphere was frosty, and I seriously wanted to get out of there. Mr. Stafford apologized to me for being dragged into all this drama. I felt super awkward, so I made out that it was getting late and left. This whole thing was such a mess, but I had my own issues to deal with. Their problems weren't anything to do with me anymore. I was finally free of Ed once and for all, and it was such a relief. A week passed, and even though I'd sent Jim dozens of messages, he hadn't replied to any of them. I was pretty sure he'd changed his number. This sucked, so I decided to meet John to explain myself to him and to see if he had Jim's contact details. I met him in a bar, and after a few drinks, I asked him, "You sent the mail to Mr. and Mrs. Stafford, right? Why did you do it?" John smiled and replied, "Because I hated Ed. He stole my Ellie and also made Jim misunderstand you. What a jerk." I replied, "For what it's worth, I really do think Ed and Ellie love each other. Besides, Ellie isn't right for you. You'll find someone amazing, John. You just wait." After that, I told John everything that had happened and admitted my love for Jim. To my surprise, John smiled and told me that he already knew everything, as one time, when he was going to surprise Ellie with a cake, he overheard Ed telling her how he was paying for my dad's medical bills in exchange for me pretending to be his girlfriend. Then he hugged Ellie and kissed her on the top of the head. After that, John had doubts about their relationship, so he followed them and took some pictures. After discovering the truth, John met Jim to tell him everything, but Jim just looked sad. Then John said,
I've thought about this a lot, and I think the real reason Jim was so disappointed was because when you ran into difficulties, you went to Ed for help instead of him.
It hadn't even crossed my mind how bad it must have looked. All I could think about was my dad and how I needed to help him, which is why I jumped on Ed's offer of financial help. In hindsight, I should have discussed it with Jim first. I told John how much I missed Jim and wanted to see him. He said he'd try to help, but he didn't know where Jim was either, and that knowing his brother, he probably just needed some time to process everything. A whole month passed by, and I hadn't heard a word from Jim. Every morning when I saw John at work, I hoped today would be the day he had good news for me, but it never happened. Jim definitely seemed to be a man who didn't want to be found. At least, not by me. I missed him like crazy and just wanted to hug him tight so that he couldn't disappear. Everyone in the company now knew the truth about Ed and Ellie. At first, they were shocked and talked about nothing else. But now, no one seemed that bothered. For me, I wasn't angry with them anymore. Life was too short for that. Anyway, Ed insisted on still paying my dad's medical bills, which I was very thankful for. One day, Ed and Ellie suddenly texted that they wanted to meet me. I was kind of curious, so I met them at a cafe near our company. I walked in to see both of them looked so happy together. It seemed like things got better for them. Am I interrupting this lovely moment? I joked and sat down next to Ellie. She blushed, and I'd never seen her so happy before. Ed told me that his parents seemed to accept their relationship. Even Mrs. Stafford was beginning to mellow down, and she hadn't kicked Ellie out. Then Ellie said, "We wanted to make amends for everything we put you through, so we found Jim for you." Then she pulled out an envelope from her bag and said it was Jim's address and a letter of recommendation if I wanted to apply to the company where Jim was working. Was it real? I couldn't believe it. Finally, I'd found him! There was no more time to waste, so I packed my bag and hopped on a plane. Even though it was dark when I landed, I went straight to the address Ellie had given me. When I was walking in the courtyard of the building with my suitcase, then suddenly, I saw someone. OMG. It was Jim! I couldn't believe it. I dropped the suitcase and ran to hug him. At first, Jim looked shocked and tried to push me away, but then he hugged me back. Jim drove me to a riverside near his apartment. We sat silently, drank beer, and looked at the lights sparkling from the buildings. I asked him, "This place is great, huh? Do you come here a lot?" He stayed silent for a while, and then replied,
"One time, I found it when I was jogging. Sitting here with some cans of beer is awesome, so I often come here when I feel tired and miss you."
What he said had crushed my heart. I turned to look at him. He'd lost some weight and looked sad. I told him the truth about what had happened and said, "I'm so sorry. At that time, all I could think about was saving my dad. So when Ed called me and said he would help me, I didn't think twice. And I also thought that the deal would end soon, and I just wanted to hide it all. It's all my fault for not thinking about your feelings, but you also left me without saying anything. Even your own brother doesn't know where you are." Jim spoke out.
"I didn't tell John, as I knew he'd tell you, and I needed to be alone. When you ran into difficulties, you didn't need me. You just..."
Without letting him finish his sentence, I cried out, "You didn't even give me a chance to explain! You just left me! I miss you like crazy!" Jim rushed to hug me, wiped my tears, and comforted me.
"I'm sorry. It's all my fault. I shouldn't have left like that. I really miss you too."
We kissed, and I still wondered if this was just a dream. Finally, I'd found him, and I definitely wasn't losing him again. When we finished kissing, I looked up and saw a shooting star. OMG. It was such an amazing end to the perfect day, and I took it as a sign that we were meant to be together forever. That was it. After that, I got a job at the company where Jim was working and officially moved into his apartment. Oh, And we're getting married next month, and I can't wait. If in doubt, then you should follow the wise words my granny once told me. There are only a few good people left out there. So when you find the right person, you've got to fight for them. It might not feel like the right time, but ask yourself this: when is? Don't let the past ruin your future. So basically, you should always follow your heart and not let what's meant to be pass you by.